pencils, pennies, paper clips. They're disposable. We don't think that much about them, do we? There's always more. And I'm not talking about expensive pencils, that are special, or rarely minted pennies or gold-plated paper clips, just ordinary, abundant ones. So hold on to that. Kind of switching gears, but it'll make sense in a moment. The American robin, or robin redbreast, we have lots of them around here. It's the bird I probably see the most in my yard. I looked it up. There are approximately 310 million robins worldwide. But did you know that the most populous bird in the world is the red-billed quail? There are about 1.5 billion of these birds. Now, if you've not heard of it, I never had either until I looked this up. They live in sub-Saharan Africa. And interestingly, as you read through the description, they're described as a sparrow-like bird. So robins, sparrows, red-billed quail, ordinary, they're super abundant birds. They're the pencils, the pennies, and the paper clips of the bird world. From our gospel reading today, Jesus says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father." Did you catch that? Whose Father? Not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. Jesus is teaching here, and nobody's repented. Nobody's prayed any prayers. And yet he already says, God is your Father. Interesting. What does Jesus want to communicate to his disciples and to us in his words from Matthew's gospel reading today? Well, the passage comes in a context of Jesus giving his disciples instructions as they go out to be his witnesses. And within these instructions, he begins to warn them about the authorities that are going to come after them as they do this. That this message of love really is going to end up in them suffering. Suffering physically and suffering emotionally. People are going to begin to call them names, to stereotype them, to categorize them, to malign them, to ridicule them. And so there's plenty to be afraid of there. You're going to suffer violence, right? Emotional, perhaps physical. People are going to turn on you. And yet in the midst of these instructions, Jesus says, do not be afraid. Why not? Really? I mean, what good reason does Jesus give us to listen to him rather than the pressures of the vocal crowds? Why should we pay attention to what he's saying? Because in the midst of this, Jesus frankly and quite directly tells us that we're facing 2 different kinds of enemies. There's the enemy that can kill the body, and this one is obvious to the hearers. That would have been Rome, the political authority, right, has the ability of execution to kill the body, political might. But to whom is Jesus referring when he says, quote, "Be afraid of those who can destroy the soul in hell"? Wow. Well, I want to bring to your recollection the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10. One of my favorite verses. that Jesus addressing says, "The thief comes but to steal, to kill, and to destroy. But I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." The thief comes to destroy. What does he say here to the disciples? Be afraid of those who can destroy the soul in hell. So careful. Many of us, if not most of us, immediately assume that that's God. Jesus isn't speaking about God here. Or else he said the wrong thing in John. The thief is the one who comes to destroy, for destruction, and to kill. Jesus comes in the name of the Father for life. So Jesus is saying, be afraid of the one who can destroy the soul in hell. Who is this? Well, as compared to Rome, even, there were darker enemies that were battling for the soul of God's people, using a desire for justice and vengeance is the bait on the hook. This desire for justice to get them concerned. But we, as God's children, are never more at risk than when we are lured into fighting the darkness with darkness. Fighting darkness with more darkness. This is the road that leads to the smoldering trash heap of hell. Jesus wants his disciples, and indeed all of his followers, to be well aware of it. This, he says, is the thing that you should be watchful for, to be afraid of. But in this passage, as Jesus goes on, thank God we have the gospel. Fear is not the last word, is it? So outweighing those fears which Jesus brings to our attention, he gives us some more amazing insight about his Father. And this, then, is why he tells us not to be afraid. In fact, it's the whole point. And it's why Jesus contrasts so starkly those who seek our destruction in the fiery pits of hell with the infinite loving care of his Father. There's a huge contrast in this passage. He's saying God is in fact the one that you can trust with your lives, with your souls, with your bodies, with everything. Again, hear it from Matthew's gospel. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And yet, not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs on your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Well, friends, we have about 7.8 billion brothers and sisters around the world on our planet right now. And we are all much more valuable than many sparrows or red-billed Palladius. All of us? Are all of us more valuable? Or just the gifted people, the important people, the beautiful people, the special people? Are all of us that valuable? Maybe just those who are part of the church. All of us? Perhaps it's those who act according to the way I see the world and how I think folks should live. Let me tell you something I learned about the red-billed quail. Its diet is primarily the seeds of annual grasses that just grow wild. But since farming began, they cause extensive damage to cereal crops. They go in and they travel in these huge, I don't know what you call a big bunch of birds. It's not a herd, but whatever you call them. They fly and they will wipe out cereal crops. And they're sometimes called Africa's feathered locust because of their destruction. And I bet If we asked Sean Tunney, he would tell us that the farmers hate these birds. They are destructive. Well, do you think that God notices them when they fall? When the red-billed quail falls? Actually, don't rush, because it's not a silly question. How far exactly does our Lord's compassion extend? Was Jesus just kind of throwing out a hyperbole for emphasis, or does God indeed pay attention to his creation and notices when a sparrow falls? I can say the reading from Matthew's Gospel is so serendipitous for us today, because today we celebrate Father's Day. And Jesus wants his disciples to know, and he wants you and I to know as well, that his Father, your Father, is not to be feared, but he's known as caring for all. He notices when the sparrow or the robin or the red-billed quail falls from the heavens. And we're much more valuable than many sparrows. So he's caring for all of his abundant children that roam in his amazing creation. Now, we can believe that God might notice us, and he might know the number of hairs on our heads, which is more numerous for some than others. But what about those with whom we disapprove? Does God bother with them? What of the, as we hear from our headlines these days, what of the angry, vicious policeman or the violent, destructive rioter and looter? Perhaps they are like pencils and pennies and paper clips. There's plenty of others out there. No need to worry about them. They're disposable. Well, friends, the point Jesus gives us must stay in our focus and in our heads. The specific loving kindness and affection that God the Father has for all of his creation, but most especially for his crowning gift of humanity, you and me, and that 7.8 billion that are here now, but all that have gone before us and all that will come after us. Now, hear me clearly, this does not excuse or dismiss our darkened behavior. I don't dismiss the examples I gave and hold them up as exemplar. But at the same time, what Jesus is telling us about God's love is that he refuses to discard one precious child as meaningless. And when we do that, when we discard somebody with whom we disapprove or don't understand as meaningless or disposable, then we have become bedfellows with that enemy that Jesus told us about. The enemy that seeks to destroy our soul to the fires of hell. Our desire for order and justice and righteousness, the best way we understand them, lures us into fighting darkness with more darkness. A darkness which does not value human life, but sees it as a commodity for service. Like a pencil, or a penny, or a paperclip. Amen.